On the evening of February 17, 1988, a woman named Margaret Foster dialed what she believed was her sister's phone number from her home in Silver Spring, Maryland. She let the phone ring 6 times before someone picked up. A man's voice answered, curt and slightly irritated. "Hello." Margaret apologized immediately, explaining that she must have misdialed, and asked if this was the Reynolds residence. The man on the other end said no, that she had the wrong number, and hung up before Margaret could apologize again. She checked the number written in her address book, realized she had transposed 2 digits, and called again, this time reaching her sister without incident. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, mostly about family matters and weekend plans, and by the time Margaret hung up, she had completely forgotten about the wrong number call. She would not think about it again until FBI agents knocked on her door 7 months later and asked her to describe the conversation in exact detail. Because that wrong number, that brief 15-second exchange with an irritated stranger, had inadvertently connected Margaret Foster to one of the most damaging espionage cases in CIA history. The man who had answered her call was Robert Philip Hansen, and for the past 6 years he had been systematically betraying every classified operation he had access to, passing intelligence to Cuban intelligence services that resulted in the capture of at least 14 CIA assets, the compromise of multiple covert programs, and the deaths of at least 3 people whose identities Hansen had exposed. Robert Hansen was 43 years old in February 1988, married with 2 teenage children, living in a comfortable suburban home in Bethesda, Maryland. He worked as a senior analyst in the CIA's Directorate of Operations, specifically in the Latin America division where he handled intelligence assessments related to Cuba, Nicaragua, and other countries in the region. He had been with the agency since 1979, recruited directly from Georgetown University, where he had completed a master's degree in international relations with a focus on Soviet-Cuban relations during the Cold War. His personnel file was exemplary, multiple commendations for analytical work, security clearances renewed without incident, polygraph examinations passed consistently, and evaluations that described him as detail-oriented, reliable, and ideologically committed to the mission of American intelligence. But Robert Hansen was living a double life. Since October 1982, approximately 3 years into his career at the CIA, he had been working as an agent for the Cuban Intelligence Directorate, the DGI, Cuba's primary foreign intelligence service. The circumstances of his recruitment remained unclear even after his eventual exposure, but what became known through his later confessions and through information provided by Cuban intelligence defectors was that Hansen had been ideologically motivated rather than financially coerced. He had developed pro-Cuban sympathies during his time at Georgetown, influenced by professors who were openly critical of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, and by relationships with students from Cuba who had painted a romanticized picture of the Castro regime. By the time he joined the CIA, Hansen had already made the decision to work against the organization from within, a decision driven by his belief that U.S. intelligence operations in Cuba were morally wrong, and that helping Cuba defend itself from American aggression was justified. His recruitment by the DGI had occurred during a trip to Mexico City in 1982, a trip Hansen had taken under the pretense of academic research, but which had actually been arranged through intermediaries connected to Cuban intelligence. He had met with a DGI officer in a hotel room, agreed to provide information in exchange for modest payments that would be deposited in accounts he could access discreetly, and received training in basic tradecraft that would allow him to communicate with his handlers without drawing attention from CIA counterintelligence. Over the next 6 years, Hansen had passed thousands of pages of classified documents to the DGI, using a combination of dead drops, encrypted communications, and occasional face-to-face meetings in neutral countries during vacations or work-related travel. The information he provided included the identities of CIA assets operating in Cuba, details about covert programs targeting the Castro government, assessments of Cuban military capabilities, and intelligence about U.S. policy deliberations regarding Cuba and Nicaragua. The damage he caused was catastrophic. At least 14 individuals working as CIA informants inside Cuba were arrested between 1983 and 1987, interrogated by Cuban state security, and in 3 cases executed after being convicted of espionage. Multiple operations that had taken years to develop were compromised and shut down, and the CIA's ability to gather intelligence on Cuba was severely degraded, leaving American policymakers operating with incomplete and outdated information during a critical period of the Cold War. But Hansen had been careful, extraordinarily careful, and for 6 years he had operated without ever coming under serious suspicion. He maintained a normal workload, socialized with colleagues, attended office functions, and gave no indication that he was anything other than a dedicated CIA officer. He followed the tradecraft protocols his Cuban handlers had taught him, varying his routines, conducting surveillance detection runs before servicing dead drops, and avoiding any behavior that might trigger a security review. And he would have continued operating indefinitely, if not for a random occurrence that had nothing to do with counterintelligence or investigative skill. A wrong number phone call that placed him in contact, however briefly, with someone whose number he should never have appeared connected to. Margaret, Foster's sister, the person Margaret had been trying to reach when she misdialed, was named Elizabeth Reynolds. Elizabeth Reynolds was married to a man named Thomas Reynolds, and Thomas Reynolds worked as a senior case officer in the CIA's Directorate of Operations, the same directorate where Robert Hansen worked. But more specifically, Thomas Reynolds was one of 3 officers leading an internal CIA investigation into suspected intelligence leaks related to Cuban operations. The investigation, which had been quietly underway since early 1987, had been triggered by the arrest of multiple CIA assets in Cuba over a short period. Arrests that suggested someone with access to classified information was feeding intelligence to Cuban security services. Reynolds and his team had been reviewing personnel files, monitoring communications, and looking for patterns that might point to a mole within the agency. The investigation had produced dozens of potential leads, but no definitive suspect. What Reynolds did not know, what no one in the CIA knew at that time, was that the person they were looking for was sitting 2 floors above him in the same building, accessing the same databases, and in some cases reading the same reports about the investigation that Reynolds was generating. The connection between Margaret Foster's wrong number call and Robert Hansen would not be made for months, and it would not have been made at all except for a technical anomaly in how the CIA monitored telephone communications for its employees during that era. In the mid-1980s, the CIA had implemented a system designed to track all phone calls made to or from the home phones of employees who held top-secret clearances and who worked in particularly sensitive positions. The system, which operated through cooperation with telephone companies, and which was classified at the time, though it has since been partially disclosed through declassified documents, created logs of phone numbers that connected to CIA employees' home lines, not recordings of the conversations themselves, just the numbers, the timestamps, and the duration of the calls. The stated purpose of this monitoring was counterintelligence, to identify if foreign intelligence services were attempting to make contact with CIA employees, or if employees were making unexplained calls to numbers associated with foreign embassies or known intelligence operatives. The system generated enormous amounts of data, most of it routine and harmless. Family members calling, friends calling, telemarketers calling. But occasionally, the data would reveal something worth investigating. In March 1988, approximately 1 month after Margaret Foster's wrong number call, a CIA analyst named Patricia Chen was reviewing phone logs for employees in the Latin America division as part of routine counterintelligence monitoring. Chen's job was tedious, scanning through lists of numbers and cross-referencing them with databases to identify anything that stood out: foreign country codes, numbers associated with diplomatic facilities, repeated calls to the same unfamiliar number. Most days, she found nothing worth reporting. But on March 18, 1988, while reviewing logs for the previous month, Chen noticed something unusual. Robert Hansen's home phone number appeared in the call log for Thomas Reynolds, showing an incoming call that had lasted approximately 15 seconds on the evening of February 17th. This was odd because Hansen and Reynolds worked in the same directorate but did not work together directly, and there was no obvious reason why Hansen would be calling Reynolds at home. Chen flagged the entry and passed it up the chain to her supervisor, a counterintelligence officer named David Kellerman, who had spent 15 years tracking potential insider threats within the CIA. Kellerman reviewed the flagged entry and agreed it was worth investigating, not because a 15-second call was inherently suspicious, but because Hansen and Reynolds had no documented professional or personal relationship that would explain the contact. Kellerman initiated a quiet inquiry, checking whether Hansen and Reynolds had any connection outside of work, whether their families knew each other, whether there was any legitimate reason for a phone call between them. The inquiry revealed nothing. Reynolds, when discreetly asked by Kellerman whether he knew Robert Hansen personally, said that he recognized the name from internal directories but had never worked with him directly, and certainly had never called him or received a call from him. This discrepancy was significant. If Reynolds was telling the truth and Kellerman had no reason to doubt him, then the phone log entry suggested that someone had called Hansen's number, but it had not been Reynolds himself. Kellerman expanded the investigation, pulling the full phone log for Reynolds' home line for the same time period, and what he found was a second call, made just 3 minutes after the first, from the same originating number to a different number that, when cross-referenced with CIA databases, belonged to Reynolds' wife's sister, Margaret Foster. The pattern became clear. Someone had called Hansen's number by mistake, realized the error, and then called the correct number, which belonged to a family member of Thomas Reynolds. This scenario, a simple wrong number, was entirely plausible, and on its own would not warrant further investigation. But Kellerman could not ignore the fact that the wrong number had connected Hansen, a CIA officer with access to sensitive information about Cuban operations, to the household of Thomas Reynolds, the officer leading the investigation into leaks related to those same operations. Kellerman made the decision to dig deeper, not because he believed Hansen was guilty of anything, but because due diligence required eliminating coincidences that might not be coincidences at all. Over the next 2 months, Kellerman conducted a comprehensive background review of Robert Hansen, pulling his employment file, his security clearance applications, his financial records, his travel history, and every assessment or polygraph report that had been generated during his time at the CIA. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Hansen's financials showed no unexplained income or large cash deposits. His travel was consistent with vacation trips and work-related assignments. His polygraph results were clean, no deception indicated, no red flags raised. But Kellerman noticed something that gave him pause. Hansen's last polygraph examination had been conducted in October 1986, approximately 16 months earlier, and the questions asked during that session had been routine, focused on whether Hansen had disclosed classified information to unauthorized persons, whether he had contact with foreign intelligence services, whether he had any financial difficulties that might make him vulnerable to recruitment. Hansen had answered no to all of these questions, and the polygraph examiner had concluded that his responses were truthful. But polygraphs were not infallible, and Kellerman knew from experience that skilled liars, particularly those who had been trained in counterinterrogation techniques, could sometimes beat the test by controlling their physiological responses or by rationalizing their lies in ways that reduced stress. Kellerman requested authorization to place Hansen under discreet surveillance, a request that required approval from senior CIA leadership because surveilling a CIA officer was an extraordinary measure that carried significant legal and operational complications. The request was reviewed by the Deputy Director for Operations and by the CIA's Office of Security, and after several days of deliberation, approval was granted. The surveillance would be limited in scope, focused primarily on Hansen's movements outside of work, his communications, and his contacts, and it would be conducted with absolute secrecy to avoid alerting Hansen or damaging his reputation if the investigation ultimately cleared him. The surveillance began on May 23, 1988. FBI agents, working in coordination with CIA counterintelligence, established rotating teams that monitored Hansen's home, followed him during his commute to and from Langley, and tracked his activities on weekends and evenings. For the first 2 weeks, nothing unusual was observed. Hansen went to work, came home, attended his daughter's soccer games, had dinner with his family at local restaurants, and behaved exactly as one would expect a suburban CIA analyst to behave. But on June 9, 1988, Hansen deviated from his routine in a way that immediately raised alarms. On that Thursday evening, Hansen told his wife he needed to run errands and left the house at approximately 7:30 p.m. Surveillance teams followed him as he drove south on Wisconsin Avenue, turned onto Massachusetts Avenue, and continued into Northwest Washington. He parked his car near DuPont Circle, a busy commercial and residential area, and began walking, not with the purposeful stride of someone heading to a specific destination, but with the deliberate, circuitous movements of someone conducting a surveillance detection run, checking to see if he was being followed. Hansen walked for nearly 40 minutes, doubling back on his route, stopping to look in store windows, pausing at intersections to observe the people around him. The surveillance teams experienced in tracking subjects who were conducting counter-surveillance adapted their tactics, rotating agents, using vehicles to leapfrog ahead, maintaining visual contact without getting close enough to be detected. Eventually, Hansen seemed satisfied that he was not being followed. He walked to a park bench near 18th Street and sat down, remaining there for approximately 8 minutes. Then he stood up, walked to a trash receptacle approximately 30 feet away, reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out what appeared to be a folded manila envelope, and placed it carefully inside the trash can, pushing it down beneath crumpled papers and food wrappers so it would not be immediately visible. Hansen then walked away, returning to his car and driving home. The entire sequence had taken just over an hour. Surveillance agents waited until Hansen had left the area, then moved in to retrieve the envelope. It was recovered intact, a standard 9x12 manila envelope sealed with tape. Inside were photocopied pages of a CIA intelligence report, classified secret, detailing current assessments of Cuban military readiness and identifying individuals within the Cuban government who were believed to be providing information to American intelligence. The envelope also contained a handwritten note, brief and coded, referencing a meeting location and a date 3 weeks in the future. The evidence was devastating and conclusive. Robert Hansen was not only passing classified information to a foreign power, he was doing so actively, using tradecraft that indicated training and experience. The decision was made at the highest levels of the CIA and the Department of Justice to continue surveillance rather than arrest Hansen immediately, a decision driven by the need to identify his handlers, to understand the full scope of his operation, and to gather enough evidence to support a prosecution that would result in a lengthy prison sentence. Over the next 6 weeks, surveillance teams documented 3 additional dead drops, each executed with the same careful methodology. Hansen would leave his home in the evening, conduct a surveillance detection run, service the dead drop by placing materials in a prearranged location, and return home. The materials he passed included photocopies of classified documents, summaries of intelligence reports, and in one case, a list of CIA officers working in the Latin America division, along with their cover identities and operational assignments. On July 21, 1988, surveillance teams observed a man retrieving one of the packages Hansen had left in a dead drop location in Rock Creek Park. The man was followed to a residence in northwest Washington that was subsequently identified as housing for Cuban diplomatic personnel. Further investigation confirmed that the man was Alfredo Mendez, a Cuban intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover as a cultural attaché at the Cuban Interests section in Washington. The connection was complete. Hansen was passing classified CIA information to Cuban intelligence, and the DGI was using diplomatic cover to service the dead drops and exfiltrate the materials. The decision to arrest Hansen was made in late July, with the operation scheduled for the morning of August 2, 1988. The arrest would be conducted at Hansen's home before he left for work, minimizing the risk that he would detect the operation and attempt to flee or destroy evidence. On the morning of August 2nd at 6:47 a.m., approximately 20 FBI agents and CIA security officers surrounded Hansen's residence in Bethesda. 4 agents approached the front door while others secured the backyard and side entrances. At exactly 6:50 a.m., agents knocked loudly and announced their presence. "FBI, we have a warrant. Open the door." Inside the house, Robert Hansen was in the kitchen pouring coffee when he heard the pounding. He froze, the mug still in his hand, understanding immediately what was happening. His wife, Carol, who had been upstairs getting ready for work, came down the stairs asking what was going on. Hansen set the mug down carefully on the counter, turned to face the door, and told Carol not to open it, to let him handle this. But before he could reach the door, agents used a battering ram to force it open, flooding into the house with weapons drawn, shouting commands for everyone to get on the ground, hands visible, "Do not move." Hansen complied immediately, dropping to his knees and placing his hands behind his head. Carol screamed, demanding to know what was happening, why federal agents were in her home. Their 2 children, 16-year-old Sarah and 14-year-old Michael, emerged from their bedrooms upstairs, terrified and confused. Agents moved through the house systematically, securing each room, ensuring no one could flee or destroy evidence. Hansen was handcuffed, pulled to his feet, and informed that he was under arrest for espionage. Carol collapsed against the wall, sobbing, insisting there had been a mistake, that her husband worked for the CIA, that he would never betray his country. But Hansen said nothing, his face expressionless, his eyes focused on the floor. He was led out of the house in handcuffs, placed in the back of an unmarked sedan, and driven to FBI headquarters in Washington. The search of Hansen's home lasted 7 hours. Agents dismantled closets, pulled up floorboards, searched the attic and basement, and examined every piece of electronic equipment. What they found was a trove of evidence that confirmed the scope of Hansen's betrayal. Hidden in the basement behind a false panel in the wall was a locked metal box containing approximately $40,000 in cash, divided into bundles and stored in waterproof bags. In Hansen's home office, agents found a typewriter that forensic analysis would later match to the notes Hansen had included in his dead drop packages. In a file cabinet disguised as a storage chest in the garage, agents discovered photocopies of dozens of classified documents, materials Hansen had apparently kept as insurance or reference, violating every protocol for handling classified information. And on Hansen's personal computer, which required specialized forensic tools to access because Hansen had password-protected the files, agents found detailed logs of every dead drop he had conducted over the past 6 years, including dates, locations, descriptions of the materials passed, and coded references to payments received. The evidence was overwhelming, more than sufficient to support multiple charges under the Espionage Act, and more than sufficient to ensure that Hansen would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. But the immediate priority for the FBI and CIA was not prosecution. It was damage assessment, determining exactly what Hansen had compromised, who had been put at risk, and what operations needed to be shut down or restructured to mitigate the damage he had caused. Robert Hansen was transported from his Bethesda home to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. on the morning of August 2, 1988. Arriving at approximately 7:23 a.m., he was processed through intake, photographed again in federal custody, and placed in a secure interview room on the third floor. The room was deliberately austere, designed to be psychologically uncomfortable without being overtly hostile. White walls, fluorescent lighting, a metal table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, and a mirror that everyone understood was two-way glass. Hansen sat in the chair facing the mirror, handcuffed, still wearing the clothes he had been wearing when agents burst into his kitchen. Special Agent David Kellerman, the counterintelligence officer who had initiated the investigation based on the telephone log anomaly, entered the room at 8:15 a.m., accompanied by a second agent, Thomas Brennan, who would serve as the primary interrogator. Both men had spent the previous months reviewing every detail of Hansen's life, his employment history, his travel patterns, his financial records. They knew more about Robert Hansen than most people knew about their closest friends, and what they knew told them that Hansen was not going to cooperate easily. The interrogation began with standard questions. State your full name. Robert Philip Hansen. Date of birth. March the 17th, 1945. Current employment. Senior analyst, Central Intelligence Agency, Latin America Division. Brennan asked Hansen if he understood why he had been arrested. Hansen looked directly at Brennan and said, "I assume you believe I've committed espionage. Do you have an attorney you'd like to contact before we continue this conversation?" Hansen paused, then said, "Not at this time. I'll answer your questions." What followed was a carefully orchestrated psychological engagement that would last, with breaks, for approximately 14 hours over the course of that first day. Brennan and Kellerman had developed a strategy based on their assessment of Hansen's personality profile. He was intelligent, ideologically committed, and likely to respond better to intellectual engagement than to threats or emotional manipulation. They began not by accusing him directly, but by laying out what they knew, piece by piece, like assembling a puzzle in front of him. They showed him surveillance photographs of the dead drops he had serviced. They showed him copies of the documents he had photographed, materials that had been recovered from his home. They showed him financial records documenting the $40,000 in cash hidden in his basement. They showed him the logs from his personal computer listing every operation he had conducted over 6 years. And they showed him photographs of Alfredo Mendez, the Cuban intelligence officer who had been retrieving Hansen's dead drop materials. They did not ask him to confess immediately. They simply presented the evidence and let him process it. Let him understand that denial was futile, that they had built a case so comprehensive that no lawyer, however skilled, would be able to dismantle it. Hansen listened without visible emotion. When Brennan asked him if he disputed any of the evidence being presented, Hansen said, "The evidence appears to be accurate." When asked if he wanted to explain his actions, Hansen said, "I acted based on my convictions. I don't expect you to understand them, but I won't insult you by claiming I was coerced or manipulated. I knew what I was doing, and I believed it was necessary." This admission, while not a full confession, was significant enough that the interrogators shifted their approach. If Hansen was willing to acknowledge his actions, Perhaps he could be persuaded to provide details that would help the CIA assess the full scope of the damage and identify other potential compromises. Brennan asked Hansen to describe how he had been recruited by Cuban intelligence. Hansen explained that the recruitment had occurred during a trip to Mexico City in 1982, a trip he had taken ostensibly for academic research, but which he had actually arranged through intermediaries who had connected him with the DGI. He described being approached by a Cuban officer who had explained that Cuba was seeking information that would help defend itself against American aggression, and that Hansen's position at the CIA made him ideally suited to provide such information. Hansen said he had agreed immediately because his ideological sympathies had already been formed, that the recruitment conversation had been less about persuasion and more about logistics. When asked why he had developed pro-Cuban sympathies, Hansen's answer was lengthy and revealed a man who had constructed an elaborate intellectual justification for his betrayal. He spoke about his time at Georgetown University, about courses he had taken on Latin American history and U.S. foreign policy, about his growing conviction that American interventions in the region were imperialistic and destructive. He spoke about the Cuban Revolution as a legitimate expression of self-determination that had been unfairly vilified by American propaganda. He spoke about believing that helping Cuba resist American intelligence operations was morally justified, even heroic. Brennan and Kellerman listened without interrupting, taking notes, allowing Hansen to articulate his worldview. What they were hearing was not particularly unusual among ideologically motivated spies, the construction of a moral framework that allowed the spy to view their betrayal as principled resistance rather than treason. But what made Hansen's case particularly damaging was not his ideology, it was his access and his competence. Over the next several hours, Hansen provided a detailed account of his espionage activities. He described the system of dead drops he had used, the encryption methods he had employed for written communications, the protocols his Cuban handlers had established for emergency contact. He identified approximately 30 classified documents and intelligence reports he had passed to the DGI over 6 years. Materials that ranged from CIA assessments of Cuban military capabilities to lists of agency assets operating in Cuba and Nicaragua. He described how he had photographed documents using a miniature camera, how he had developed the film in a dark room he had set up in his basement under the pretense of pursuing photography as a hobby, and how he had packaged the materials in waterproof containers before placing them in dead drops. When Brennan asked Hansen whether he understood that his actions had resulted in the arrests and executions of CIA informants in Cuba, Hansen's response was chilling in its detachment. He said, "I understood that providing information about CIA assets would likely lead to their capture. I regret that some of them may have been executed, but I believed that exposing American intelligence operations in Cuba was necessary to protect Cuban sovereignty. The people who were arrested were working against their own government. From the Cuban perspective, they were traitors." Hansen's interrogation continued over the following days with sessions conducted morning and afternoon, each lasting several hours. The FBI and CIA were building not just a criminal case but a comprehensive damage assessment, and they needed Hansen's cooperation to fully understand what had been compromised. In exchange for his cooperation, federal prosecutors offered Hansen a plea agreement. If he provided complete and truthful information about his espionage activities, if he helped identify every document he had passed and every contact he had made, the government would recommend a sentence of life in prison rather than seeking the death penalty. Hansen's attorney, a federal public defender named Margaret Sullivan, who had been assigned to the case after Hansen finally requested legal representation, advised him to accept the plea agreement. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and a trial would only result in the same outcome with the added possibility of a death sentence. Hansen agreed, and on September 14, 1988, he appeared in federal court to enter a guilty plea to multiple charges of espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, and acting as an agent of a foreign government. The plea hearing was brief. The judge asked Hansen if he understood the charges against him and the consequences of pleading guilty. Hansen said yes. The judge asked if anyone had coerced him into pleading guilty. Hansen said no. The judge asked if he had in fact committed the crimes to which he was pleading guilty. Hansen said, "I provided classified information to Cuban intelligence services. I did so willingly and knowingly. I understood it was illegal, and I did it anyway." The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for November 15, 1988. In the interim, federal prosecutors and CIA analysts worked to assess the full extent of the damage Hansen had caused. The damage assessment, completed in late October 1988 and classified top secret with compartmented access restrictions, painted a devastating picture. Hansen had compromised at least 14 CIA assets operating in Cuba, individuals who had been providing intelligence on Cuban government activities, military capabilities, and internal politics. Of these 14 assets, 3 had been executed by Cuban state security after being convicted of espionage in closed trials. 4 had been sentenced to lengthy prison terms in Cuban facilities where conditions were known to be brutal. 2 had been released after extensive interrogation but were now under permanent surveillance and had lost their livelihoods. The remaining 5 had managed to evade arrest, either because they had been warned by contacts within Cuban intelligence who were themselves working for the CIA, or because Cuban authorities had chosen not to act on the information immediately to avoid revealing the existence of Hansen as a source. Hansen had also compromised multiple covert programs targeting the Castro government, including operations designed to gather intelligence on Cuban military support for leftist insurgencies in Central America. These programs, which had taken years to develop and had cost millions of dollars, were shut down immediately after Hansen's arrest, because there was no way to know how much Cuban intelligence knew about them. The assessment noted that Hansen's reporting had provided Cuban intelligence with detailed information about CIA analytical methods, about how the agency assessed threats and prioritized targets, and about internal debates within the U.S. intelligence community regarding Cuba policy. This information, while not directly operational, gave Cuban intelligence planners insights that would help them anticipate and counter future CIA activities. The 3 individuals who had been executed as a result of Hansen's betrayal were named in the classified assessment, though their identities have never been publicly released. What is known from testimony provided during Hansen's sentencing hearing is that one of them was a mid-level official in the Cuban Ministry of Defense who had been providing detailed information about Cuban military readiness and weapons procurement. Another was a telecommunications engineer who had been passing information about Cuban signals intelligence capabilities. The third was a government administrator who had been reporting on internal political dynamics within the Cuban Communist Party. All 3 had been arrested within months of Hansen passing their identities to his Cuban handlers. All 3 had been interrogated, tried in closed proceedings, and executed by firing squad. Their families, according to information later obtained through human rights organizations, were told that the executions had been carried out for crimes against the state, but were provided no additional details. The human cost of Hansen's espionage extended beyond the individuals who were arrested or killed. CIA officers who had recruited and managed these assets, who had spent years building relationships of trust, were left to grapple with the knowledge that their work had led directly to the deaths of people who had trusted them. Several officers requested transfers out of Latin America operations. At least 2 left the CIA entirely, unable to continue working in an environment where they could not be certain that their operations were secure. The families of the executed assets, who in most cases had not known that their relatives were working for American intelligence, were left with grief and confusion, wondering what had led to the arrests and executions. And within the CIA itself, the Hansen case triggered a crisis of confidence about internal security, about how a senior analyst with access to sensitive information could have operated as a double agent for 6 years without being detected. Hansen's sentencing hearing on November 15, 1988 was held in Federal District Court in Washington, D.C., with limited public access due to the classified nature of much of the evidence. The prosecution presented a detailed accounting of Hansen's crimes, the documents he had stolen, the assets he had compromised, the operations he had betrayed. They described him as one of the most damaging moles in CIA history, an officer who had systematically betrayed his oath, his colleagues, and his country for ideological reasons that did not mitigate the severity of his crimes. The prosecution recommended a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. Hansen's attorney, Margaret Sullivan, presented a defense that focused not on denying his actions but on providing context. She argued that Hansen had been motivated by genuine political convictions, that he had believed his actions were morally justified, and that while he had violated the law, he had not been driven by greed or personal gain. She noted that Hansen had cooperated extensively with investigators, that he had provided information that allowed the CIA to assess the damage and take corrective measures, and that he had expressed remorse for the individuals who had been harmed as a result of his actions. She requested that the court impose a sentence of 25 years rather than life, arguing that Hansen was 43 years old and that 25 years would effectively be a life sentence given his age. Hansen was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. He stood, spoke briefly, and said that he understood he had broken the law, that he accepted responsibility for his actions, and that he regretted the deaths of the 3 Cuban citizens who had been executed. But he also said that he did not regret his decision to work against what he viewed as American imperialism, that he believed history would judge U.S. policies in Latin America harshly, and that he had acted according to his conscience. The judge, a veteran federal jurist named Eleanor Martinez, who had presided over multiple espionage cases during her career, listened to Hansen's statement without expression. Then she delivered her sentence. She noted that Hansen had held a position of extraordinary trust, that he had been entrusted with protecting American national security, and that he had betrayed that trust systematically and deliberately over a period of 6 years. She noted that his actions had resulted in the deaths of at least 3 people, and had compromised the safety of many others. She noted that while his cooperation had been valuable, it did not erase the damage he had caused. She sentenced Robert Hansen to life in prison without possibility of parole. He was remanded to federal custody immediately and was transported that afternoon to a maximum security federal facility, where he would spend the remainder of his life. The impact of Hansen's arrest and conviction extended far beyond the courtroom. For Carol Hansen, his wife of 18 years, the revelation that her husband had been working as a Cuban spy was devastating and incomprehensible. Carol had believed she was married to a dedicated CIA analyst, a man who worked long hours, who occasionally traveled for work, who was committed to his career and his family. The discovery that he had been living a double life, that he had been photographing classified documents in their basement, that he had been placing those documents in dead drops while she believed he was running errands, shattered her understanding of reality. Carol cooperated fully with the FBI's investigation, submitting to multiple interviews, allowing agents to search the family home, providing access to financial records and personal correspondence. The FBI concluded that Carol had no knowledge of her husband's espionage activities, that she had been an unwitting victim of his deception. But that conclusion did not ease the trauma of betrayal. Carol filed for divorce in December 1988. a process that was complicated by the fact that Hansen was in federal prison, and that their assets, including the family home, were subject to forfeiture under federal law as proceeds of criminal activity. The $40,000 in cash that had been found in Hansen's basement was seized, as were other assets that prosecutors argued had been purchased with payments from Cuban intelligence. Carol was eventually granted the divorce and was allowed to retain some assets, but she was left in a precarious financial position, struggling to support herself and her 2 teenage children on a limited income. Sarah Hansen, who had been 16 at the time of her father's arrest, and Michael Hansen, who had been 14, faced the immediate and overwhelming challenge of being publicly identified as the children of a traitor. The arrest had been covered extensively in the media, with newspapers and television news broadcasts describing Robert Hansen as a CIA officer who had betrayed his country to Cuba. Sarah and Michael's names were initially withheld from media coverage because they were minors, but within their community in Bethesda, everyone knew who they were. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Teachers didn't know how to talk to them. Sarah, who had been a straight-A student planning to attend college, found herself unable to concentrate in school, unable to participate in activities that had once been important to her. She withdrew socially, stopped attending extracurricular events, and spent most of her time alone. Michael, younger and perhaps more confused than angry, struggled to understand why his father had done what he did, why he had chosen ideology over family, why he had been willing to risk everything for a cause that Michael didn't understand. Carol made the decision to move the family to a different state in early 1989, hoping that a fresh start in a place where no one knew their history would allow Sarah and Michael to rebuild their lives. They relocated to Oregon, changed their last name legally to Carol's maiden name, and attempted to construct new identities separate from the scandal that had defined them. Sarah graduated from high school in Oregon, attended a state university, and eventually became a social worker specializing in helping families affected by trauma. In interviews conducted years later as part of academic research on families of convicted spies, Sarah described the experience of being her father's daughter as a form of complex grief. She said she mourned not just the loss of her father to prison, but the loss of the father she thought she had known, the man who had helped her with homework, who had taught her to ride a bike, who had seemed normal and loving and present. She said the hardest part was reconciling those memories with the knowledge of what he had been doing, the photographs he had been taking, the classified documents he had been stealing, the people whose lives he had endangered. She said she visited him in prison once, in 2003, 15 years after his arrest, and that the meeting had been brief and painful. He had tried to explain his actions, to tell her that he had believed he was fighting for justice, but his explanations had felt hollow and self-serving. She said she left the prison feeling that she had said goodbye to someone she had never really known. Michael took a different path. He refused to visit his father in prison, refused to maintain any contact with him, and spent years angry not just at Robert, but at the entire situation, at the CIA for hiring him, at Cuban intelligence for recruiting him, at the media for turning their family's trauma into a public spectacle. Michael eventually moved to California, worked in technology, married, and had children of his own. He told his wife about his father only after they had been together for several years, describing it as the hardest conversation he had ever had, the admission that his father was in federal prison for espionage. He said his children did not know about their grandfather, that he had made the decision to protect them from that knowledge for as long as possible, and that he did not know whether that decision was right or whether he was simply repeating the patterns of secrecy that had defined his own childhood. The CIA's internal investigation into how Hansen had operated undetected for 6 years led to significant changes in security procedures, polygraph protocols, and counterintelligence monitoring, The agency implemented more frequent and more rigorous background checks for employees with access to sensitive information. It expanded the use of random audits to detect unauthorized access to classified materials. It enhanced its systems for monitoring employee financial activities, looking for unexplained income or expenditures that might indicate foreign payments. And it created new protocols for investigating anomalies, no matter how small, that might indicate insider threats. But these procedural changes could not address the deeper cultural issues that the Hansen case had exposed. The CIA, like any large organization, operated on trust, on the assumption that employees who had been vetted and cleared could be relied upon to act in accordance with their oaths and their obligations. The discovery that someone like Hansen, a senior analyst with an exemplary record and no obvious red flags, could betray that trust so completely forced the agency to confront uncomfortable questions about how well it really knew its own people and whether the systems designed to protect against insider threats were sufficient. The case also had diplomatic repercussions. The United States formally protested to Cuba through diplomatic channels, demanding that Cuba acknowledge Hansen's espionage and provide information about other potential Cuban intelligence operations in the United States. Cuba, predictably, denied any knowledge of Hansen, maintained that the accusations were fabrications designed to justify American hostility toward Cuba, and refused to provide any cooperation. This response was standard for such cases, and no one expected anything different, but it reinforced the adversarial relationship between the two countries and complicated efforts to engage in any kind of meaningful dialogue. Within the Cuban intelligence community, according to information later obtained through defectors, Hansen was considered a highly successful operation, an asset who had provided valuable intelligence over an extended period, and whose compromise had been the result of bad luck rather than operational errors. Cuban intelligence officers reportedly studied Hansen's case as an example of how to recruit and manage ideologically motivated sources, how to maintain security through disciplined tradecraft, and how to extract maximum value from an asset before they were inevitably caught. This assessment was both pragmatic and chilling, a reminder that from the Cuban perspective, Hansen was not a traitor but a hero, someone who had risked his freedom and his life to serve their interests. Robert Hansen has spent more than 3 decades in federal prison as of 2024. He is currently incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, a maximum security facility that houses some of the most dangerous and high-profile federal prisoners in the country. He has limited contact with the outside world, is allowed restricted visits from immediate family, though neither his ex-wife nor his children have visited in years, and spends most of his time in solitary confinement due to security concerns. According to prison records and occasional interviews with correctional officials, Hansen has maintained that his actions were justified, that he acted according to his principles, and that he has no regrets about providing information to Cuban intelligence. Whether this is genuine conviction or a psychological defense mechanism that allows him to cope with spending his life in prison is impossible to determine. What is clear is that Hansen, now in his late 70s, will almost certainly die in federal custody, having spent more years in prison than he spent working for the CIA. The broader legacy of the Hansen case is complex. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ideological extremism, about how convictions, no matter how sincerely held, can be used to justify terrible actions. It demonstrates the vulnerability of even sophisticated intelligence organizations to insider threats, the reality that no system of vetting and monitoring can completely eliminate the risk that someone with access will choose to betray that trust. And it highlights the human cost of espionage, not just for the intelligence officers and assets who are caught in the machinery of clandestine operations, but for the families who are left to deal with the consequences of decisions they had no part in making. Margaret Foster, The woman whose wrong number phone call had inadvertently started the investigation that led to Hansen's exposure was interviewed by FBI agents in September 1988 as part of the final documentation of the case. She was asked to describe the brief conversation she had had with Hansen on the evening of February 17, 1988, to confirm the time and the content of the exchange. She told agents she barely remembered the call, that it had been a simple misdial, less than 15 seconds of interaction with a stranger who had sounded irritated that she had bothered him. When agents explained to her that this wrong number had connected her to a CIA analyst who was working as a Cuban spy, and that the phone log documenting the call had been the initial anomaly that triggered the investigation, Margaret was stunned. She said she could not believe that something so trivial, so utterly random, had led to the exposure of an espionage operation. The agent who interviewed her told her that espionage cases were often broken by exactly such trivial details, that the work of counterintelligence was about noticing small inconsistencies and following them until they led somewhere significant. Margaret Foster's wrong number call has become part of the legend of the Hansen case within the FBI and CIA, a story told to new counterintelligence officers as an example of how the smallest details can be the thread that unravels the most carefully constructed operations. It serves as a reminder that espionage is not always about dramatic confrontations or brilliant deductions, but often about patient analysis, about paying attention to anomalies that others might dismiss, and about following leads wherever they go, no matter how unlikely they might seem. The Hansen case also entered the public consciousness through books, documentaries, and academic studies that examined the nature of ideological espionage during the Cold War and beyond. Historians have used the case to explore questions about loyalty, betrayal, and the moral frameworks that individuals construct to justify actions that violate societal norms and legal obligations. Psychologists have studied Hansen as an example of how cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that arises from holding contradictory beliefs, can be resolved through elaborate rationalizations that allow individuals to maintain a positive self-image while engaging in destructive behavior. And intelligence professionals continue to study the case as a practical example of how to detect, investigate, and prosecute insider threats. For the families of the 3 Cuban citizens who were executed as a result of Hansen's espionage, there has been no closure, no acknowledgement, no justice. Their relatives died because they provided information to American intelligence, and their deaths were kept secret by a Cuban government that treated espionage cases as state security matters not subject to public disclosure. The CIA has never publicly acknowledged the identities of these individuals, maintaining that doing so would compromise other sources and methods. And so, they remain anonymous victims of a conflict that most people have forgotten, casualties of a war fought in shadows where the bodies were never counted and the names were never spoken. The story of Robert Hansen is ultimately a story about choices and their consequences. Hansen chose to betray his country based on ideological convictions that he believed justified his actions. That choice led to the deaths of at least 3 people, the imprisonment of others, the destruction of his own family, and a life sentence in a maximum security prison. The CIA chose to trust him based on background checks and polygraphs that indicated he was reliable. That choice led to 6 years of compromised operations and a security breach that damaged the agency's credibility and capabilities. Carol Hansen chose to divorce her husband and rebuild her life with her children. That choice led to years of financial struggle and emotional trauma, but also to survival and eventual recovery. Sarah and Michael Hansen chose different paths in how they dealt with their father's betrayal, one seeking understanding through visits and therapy, the other cutting off contact entirely. And Margaret Foster made no choice at all beyond dialing a phone number incorrectly. Yet her random error became the catalyst for an investigation that exposed one of the most damaging espionage cases in modern American history. These intersecting choices, some deliberate and some accidental, combine to create a narrative that captures something essential about the nature of intelligence work and the reality that beneath the grand strategic competition between nations, there are individual human beings making decisions, living with consequences, and trying to find meaning in circumstances they often do not fully control. Robert Hansen will likely die in prison. Carol Hansen has rebuilt her life. Sarah and Michael Hansen have moved forward as best they can. The 3 Cuban citizens who were executed remain unnamed and unmourned, except by families who may never know the full truth of why they died. And Margaret Foster, who made a wrong number call one evening in 1988, lives with the strange knowledge that she played a small but crucial role in a story far larger than herself. The legacy of the Hansen case endures not because it was unique, but because it was emblematic of the hidden conflicts that shaped the late Cold War era and continue to shape intelligence operations today. It reminds us that espionage is not abstract, not a game played by faceless operatives in distant locations, but a reality that touches ordinary lives in extraordinary ways. And it stands as testament to the fact that sometimes the most significant events in history turn on the smallest details: a wrong number, a parking ticket, a misplaced document. The tiny human errors that expose the grand deceptions we construct and the lies we tell ourselves about who we are and what we believe.